Welcome to the February 21st session of the Phoenix Congress, where we are writing a blueprint for a better America. This legislative package will end poverty with universal basic income, end mass incarceration with major criminal justice reform, and end the endless wars by bringing our troops home and reducing our military budget. Today's session is the 11th of 21 public hearings on the 2022 legislative package, and we'll begin with Title III. Provide for the common defense, for sections 301 to 315. These sessions will alternate between Mondays and Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern through March 28th. For those following along at home, you can find a link to the legislative package in the description below or at bit.ly/B, lowercase drop box. If you have questions about today's sections, you can submit them in the chat. And if you'd like to offer questions or other testimony for future hearings, please use the link in the description below. Before starting, I'd like to invite you to join me in reciting the preamble to the Constitution of the United States to remind us of our duties as Americans and set the intention for what we are trying to do today. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. With that, I'd like to welcome the delegate from North Carolina's 7th District to continue his testimony on the blueprint for a better America.
Thank you, Mixed Chair. And so, yes, I am currently the delegate from North Carolina's 7th District, subject to one more round of judicial review. That should be it for the 2022 election. And today we're going to start on Title III, the Ending the Endless Wars planks of the Blueprint for a Better America. And Section 301 is the findings. So once again, I'd like to just read those into the record and then talk a little bit more about them. 1. Americans have a constitutional duty to provide for the common defense, a large concern to the framers who had recently fought a protracted war of independence from one of the most powerful nations in Europe. After the Constitution was proposed to the states, Delaware promptly ratified it because as a small state with a large coastline, it was particularly vulnerable. They recognized that a union of states could accomplish more than individual and independent states. 2. Military spending serves an important role in our economy, serving as a source of income in most, if not all, congressional districts. That need can be better addressed directly with the creation of universal American Union jobs in this act, which will offset the reduced military spending in most local economies. 3. Military service has long been a source of pride among the American people. However, when it crosses the line into glorification, it can create cultural assumptions towards virtuous violence. According to journalist Matt Taibbi, these themes have contributed to a rise in mass shootings. 4. As America's global footprint has grown, the moral high ground that we held after World War II has been lost. Decades of detention in Guantanamo Bay military prison have tarnished our reputation for justice. The use of economic sanctions against civilian populations has caused countless deaths around the globe. American-made bombs are used against the people of Yemen, such as the one in August 2018 that blew up a school bus and killed dozens of preteen boys. 5. The servicemen and women who return home from our hundreds of foreign bases around the planet are sometimes traumatized by the experience of playing at being the world's policeman. In the 2 decades since 9/11, more than 30,000 former service members have taken their own lives. 6. The Earth is also harmed by these exploits, which require prodigious amounts of fossil fuels. The emissions of the United States military make it the largest single producer of greenhouse gases on the planet, even exceeding the entire national output of industrialized nations like Sweden and Denmark. Industrial chemicals scar the land at and around former military bases. 7. These problems may not have been the exact ones the framers were concerned with in 1787, but they did have a general aversion to standing armies. They tried to limit them in the Constitution by prohibiting Congress from appropriating money for the Army for more than 2 years at a time. In the centuries since, however, and especially in the last 80 years, military spending has grown to such an extent that it exceeds our constitutional mandate. The purpose of this title is to provide for the common defense in a manner closer to the framers' intention. As I've studied the Constitution and how it was written and all the effort and compromises and shared sacrifices that went into making it a success and framing our nation, it's interesting to go back and examine some of these early debates. And after the Constitution was written, a number of states demanded that there also be a Bill of Rights. And so during the discussion of what would be included in a Bill of Rights, some of the framers, like Eldridge Gerry, he was the future governor of Massachusetts and the guy who gave us the term gerrymandering, he called a standing army the bane of liberty. Other delegates demanded that a constitutional prohibition be included in a Bill of Rights so that there could not be a standing army without a two-thirds override by Congress. This wasn't really a new concept either. It was 100 years earlier when Britain had their glorious revolution, and they had adopted a Bill of Rights, which declared, quote, "The raising or keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless it be with the consent of Parliament, is against the law." So Title III is really inspired by our constitutional duty to provide for the common defense, but in a way that more closely matches the mandate that the framers set out for us. It's time to recalibrate in the 21st century and get back to our core duties. With that, Mixed Chair, that concludes my testimony for Section 301, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Seeing no questions, Section 301 is assigned to the Subcommittee on the Findings. You may proceed to Section 311.
Thank you. Section 311 is the sunset of the 2001 Authorization for Military Force. This is the root cause of a lot of our military adventures that are taking place around the globe. Back in 2001, 3 days after the attacks of September 11th, Congress passed Senate Joint Resolution 23 and this authorization for military force, which stated in one sentence, quote, "In general, that the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons, in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons." That's it. That is the one sentence that has authorized the war on terror for the last 2 decades. And we've moved beyond the original intention of this authorization that was passed back in 2001. And so it's time to sunset it and re-examine what foreign wars we should be involved in, if any. So the War Powers Act itself, it was passed back in 1973 when Congress found out that President Nixon had been bombing the nation of Cambodia during the Vietnam War and not telling Congress about it. So they passed the War Powers Act to restrict his ability as commander-in-chief to unilaterally declare war. They reclaimed the constitutional authority under Article 1, Section 9. But Nixon vetoed the War Powers Act. And so Congress came together with the necessary two-thirds to override it and make it law. And basically it says that if the president sends troops somewhere and uses force against a country, he needs to notify Congress within 48 hours. He can't be engaged in military force for more than 60 days without the approval of Congress, either through a declaration of war or an authorization of military force. And if he doesn't get it, then he has 30 days to withdraw the military force. And so again, this 2001 authorization for military force was passed in response to September 11th, and we've done it. Osama bin Laden has been dead for over a decade. Like, since this authorization for military force has been passed, he has been dead for longer than he has been alive. It's time to repeal this. Al-Qaeda has been demolished. ISIS is no more. And yet, according to the Friends Committee on National Legislation, this authorization for military force has been used to justify actions in at least 19 countries. And, quote, the 2001 authorization for military force is the legal basis used to justify all current wars. For this reason, it is often called the blank check for endless wars. And they're right. If we want to end the endless wars, we have to re-examine our policies and cancel the blank check. Now, this wouldn't be done instantly. This is a sunset. This language comes from an amendment that Congresswoman Barbara Lee offered in 2017. She was the only member of Congress to vote against the 2001 authorization for military force, raising concerns that today were totally justified, concerns about how it would be used to expand military force around the planet. And so she offered an amendment to the annual appropriations bill that would sunset the authorization for military force in 240 days. The committee supported that. Congress as a whole did not, and so it did not become law. And so under Section 311, this authorization for military force would sunset on June 30th, 2023, about 8 months after it became law, and it would sunset. It would be repealed. And so in those intervening 8 months, 2 Congresses would have the chance to take a bite at the apple and make the difficult decisions about where exactly we should be using military force in the war on terror. These will be difficult decisions to be made. I don't have any. I recognize that. I realize that, but this is Congress's responsibility to declare war. This is their duty to do these things, and to just say, well, back in 2001, we passed this authorization and that's just a blank check to keep going. No, it's wrong, and we can correct it with Section 311. So Congress, it'll make them act. And next Chair, I think that concludes my testimony for Section 311. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Seeing no questions, Section 311 is assigned to the Subcommittee on Reducing America's Global Military Footprint. You may proceed to Section 312.
Thank you. Section 312 is a repeal of the 2002 authorization for military force. And this one was passed, House Joint Resolution 114, to authorize the war in Iraq back in 2002. The war in Iraq was declared ended on December 15th, 2011, and yet this authorization for military force is still out there floating around. President Trump used it to justify the assassination of Iranian General Soleimani in the early days of 2020. This one isn't needed. It's not relevant. It should be repealed. It only offers a very specific, it's very narrow authorization. And let me just read that into the record. And House Joint Resolution 114 said, the president is authorized to use armed forces of the United States as he determines to be necessary and appropriate in order to, 1, defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq, and 2, enforce all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq. Now, we know 20 years later that Iraq didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. They weren't actually threatening the national security of the United States. And I don't believe that there's any United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq still in force. So it's time for this to be repealed. There's been a number of efforts to do so in Congress. And by including it in this larger legislative package, we can generate the necessary political force to make that happen. I guess I should also say that, this is a very, there are dozens of organizations who have signed on board with repealing this authorization for military force. And so it should be even less controversial than the previous section. With that, Mr. Chair, I think that concludes my testimony for Section 312, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question. The 1991 authorization for a military force against Iraq is still on the books. Is there any reason why that should not be repealed as well?
No, I don't think there is any reason why it shouldn't be. The sections that we're talking about today in the public hearing, they came from the recent debates over the National Defense Authorization Act and some of the foreign policy things that, the amendments that were offered. And the 1991 AUMF wasn't brought up, so it wasn't really on our radar. Since then, we've learned that Senate Joint Resolution 10 was introduced last year. It has 34 bipartisan co-sponsors, and that would repeal both of the Iraq authorization for military force, the 1991 and the 2002. And I'd be happy to work with the subcommittee to update the language of Section 312.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, Section 312 is assigned to the Subcommittee on Reducing America's Global Military Footprint. You may proceed to Section 313.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Section 313 is relative to the authorization of use of force against Iran. So I guess once again, this legislative package uses Congress's power of the pocketbook to set policy. And so specifically, this section, again, comes from a proposed amendment to the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, which would have blocked the use of appropriated funds for any military force in or against Iran unless Congress explicitly authorized it. And the Senate voted in favor of this amendment 50-40. However, thanks to the filibuster, that majority wasn't enough to actually keep it in the legislation. And so since that time, for better or worse, the saber rattling that's gone on with Iran has moved on to other countries. Let me see if I can share my screen and just bring up this section. All right. So Section 313 requiring congressional authorization for use of force against Iran. It would prohibit using any of the funds already appropriated for the military to use against Iran unless either Congress declared war or passed an authorization for military force. And again, this would comply with the War Powers Resolution. Even if this went into effect, the president, if he did have to take action against Iran, the War Powers Resolution would still apply. That as long as he gave notice to Congress within 48 hours and withdrew within 60 days, lacking any specific authorization, he would still be in compliance with this section. And we'll just clarify that Congress is asserting its constitutional authority to control where we go to war, and that this section shouldn't be construed to authorize the use of military force. I think, Mr. Chair, I think that concludes my testimony for Section 313, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Yes, here's a question. Is there still a reason to make it specific about Iran? Shouldn't this be a policy, a better policy that we use for all countries?
Yes, it would be a better policy. And you could certainly argue that this is the policy that's on the books through the War Powers Act and through the Constitution. And yet Congress is failing to meet its constitutional duty to to oversee the declarations of war and the use of military force. Yeah, I think this amendment could be clarified to apply to all countries. And if that amendment would be germane, then I'd be happy to work with the subcommittee on doing that. I think it's a better plan.
Okay. Seeing no further questions, Section 313 is assigned to the Subcommittee on Reducing America's Global Military Footprint. You may proceed to Section 314.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mixed Chair. Section 314 would reduce the military budget to 2005 spending levels over a period of 4 years. And it would do this by requiring a 10% cut in the military budget each year for 2023, 2024, 2025, 2026. It seems like the military budget it keeps going up, and we had just ended the war in Iraq. Why is it that we're continuing to spend more and more money, passing the largest defense spending bill in world history? I want to try and pull up this chart. All right, so this is U.S. military spending over the last or decades. And you can see that we've grown from 1991, 1992, $325 billion during the first Iraq War. It continued to escalate, starting in 2002, 2001 with the War on Terror, and continued to escalate up until 2011, when under President Obama, the war in Iraq was ended. And then for a number of years, we had some decreases in the military budget. And in 2017, under President Trump, it started to go back up. And President Biden has continued that path. And so I'll bring up one more chart here. This is what the Blueprint for a Better America would do. Congress projects its spending 10 years in advance, and they pass a resolution saying that the House and Senate have agreed on it. That's the current one is Senate Concurrent Resolution 14. And they've agreed to plan for a 2% increase in the military budget going forward. The Blueprint for a Better America would change that, so to a 10% cut. And so each year, 10% of waste, 10% of excessive expenditures, 10% of whatever, of all sorts of things could be cut by 10%. And this would save $826 billion in military spending over 4 years. I know there's groups that call for larger cuts to the military, and I'm sympathetic, but 10% cut, any organization can find 10% to cut, especially one whose budget has grown so significantly over the last 20 years. This language again comes from proposed amendments to the National Defense Authorization Acts. Sorry, I lost my tabs here. Let me find this again. Yeah, sorry, I just deleted it. All right. This Yeah, a 10% cut in the military budget isn't a reasonable amount to cut. It's a reasonable amount to um, to redirect back towards other priorities that America has. That those we're spending $750 billion on the military, um, and that amount of money could be better used at other places, many places back here in the United States. As we'll talk about in the next section, we have a huge military footprint around the world with some 750 military bases. As we start to close those down, there'll be large opportunities for savings. And yeah, we can. This is one of the reasons, the precise reasons that the framers were concerned about standing armies, because of the large expense of maintaining. The United States, its military budget is more than at least the next 10 largest countries combined. That total number keeps going up every year. I lose track, but it's at least the next 10 largest countries combined. And so by putting this into law, mandating a 10% cut in the military for the next 4 years, Congress will have to start making some difficult choices. But you can look at a lot of the things that we do spend our money on, like the money, like we've talked about ending the 1033 program, where military surplus gets given away to police departments. Let's stop buying that equipment. Let's cut our spending that way. Now, the obvious question is, what happens if something comes up and Congress needs to exceed this? And so subsection E is the loophole that allows that, and it allows the House and the Senate to consider an amendment to these restrictions with a 2/3 vote. It requires that it be a roll call vote so that we can see exactly how our members stood on this issue. But if 2/3 of Congress agrees that there is a need to exceed the restrictions in this section, that's the way that they can do it, is through a supermajority. And and one of the reasons that this is the third plank of the Blueprint for a Better America is because we're trying to address Dr. King's triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. And when he was alive, he spoke out against the war in Vietnam, that it was the militarism that ate up so much of the budget. And so I'd like to read just a little bit from his Beyond Vietnam speech that he gave 1 year before he was assassinated. And he said, "A true revolution of values will lay hand on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. America, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, can well lead the way in this revolution of values. There is nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from reordering our priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war." That's the radical revolution of values that we should be undertaking as we come out of the pandemic, is using wisdom, justice, and love to reorder our national priorities, to spend more on programs of social uplift instead of military defense. We can do this. by adopting the blueprint for a better America. And with that, Mixed Chair, I think that concludes my testimony for Section 314, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Yes, I have a few questions. Number one, how does this fit in with the ongoing annual auditing that is happening with the Department of Defense?
I don't think it's connected to the annual auditing. This is strictly a cap on the amount of money that can be authorized for the military budget.
Thank you. And why you'd mentioned that there are groups who call for more drastic cutting. Why 2005 levels? Why stop there? Why not a lower or larger amount? And as well as a follow-up of what about after? What happens after if it's only over 4 years?
No, those are all good questions. And the short answer is we have to start somewhere. And so this is a place to start by putting 4 years into this legislative package. That gives us enough time to see. It doesn't immediately put it up for debate again in the next election. It pushes it to the next midterm elections. It gives us a chance to see how things are going and then reevaluate when we have more data. So that's the 4 years. What do we do after that? I guess in large part, it will depend on the state of the country and the state of the world. And, if we've decided as a nation that we want to be committed to peace and justice instead of using military force, we can certainly continue taking this in the direction of reducing the military even further. But 4 years is a good amount of time to collect data and then reevaluate. As far as 10%, and 10% is a reasonable cut. It's hard to argue and say that the military can't possibly cut 10%, given their $750 billion budget. And you asked why 2005 spending levels, and that's just where it worked out. This takes us down to I closed the chart, but it's 500 and something billion dollars would be the amount authorized in 2026, which is about what we spent in 2005. The difference being in 2005, they did it in they did it in a couple different sections. The defense authorization was sort of like their normal baseline budget. And then they passed a supplemental appropriation for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan because they pretended that those were surprises and couldn't possibly have been budgeted for. But they spent about $530 billion in that year. And so we can get back down to that level again, especially now that we've ended the war in Afghanistan. Did that cover all your questions?
Yes, thank you. In seeing no further questions, Section 314 is assigned to the Subcommittee on Reducing America's Global Military Footprint. You may proceed to Section 315.
All right. Thank you. Section 315 is reducing the number of foreign military bases. According to an article published this month by the Soldier Project, the U.S. has about 350 foreign military bases. They're divided into 11 regions around the world. Central Command is estimated to have 45 to 65,000 troops across the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. In Europe, we have estimated 33,000 troops in Germany. In the Indo-Pacific Command, we're estimated to have 50 to 55,000 troops in Japan, and then another 26,000 troops in South Korea. We have troops all over the world. These troops in Germany and Japan obviously have been there since World War II. Since Joe Biden was a toddler, we have had these troops stationed there. And so at some point, we need to reevaluate, what does the end game look like? How many decades, how many lifetimes will those troops be stationed overseas? Similarly, we've got in South Korea, the 26,000. it is, I guess I would say, it is understandable North Korea's apprehension about the United States when we have 26,000 troops stationed right on their border, plus another 50,000 in Japan, just a couple hours away. And so we can de-escalate tensions by reducing our number of foreign military bases. Just to put this in context with the rest of the world, Russia, you know how many foreign military bases Russia has? About 3 dozen. So we've got more than 20 times as many foreign military bases as Russia. China has 5. We have more than 100 times as many foreign military bases as China. So reducing the number of these is essential to ending the endless wars. Now, this is the legislative package. Obviously, there is a lot of nuance in foreign policy. And so what this is about is establishing a principle, again, as a place to start. Where is the low-hanging fruit when it comes to reducing the number of foreign military bases? And so this section offers a basic principle that if the local people want us to leave, we should leave. That just seems pretty basic and respectful, is to make sure that we are still wanted everywhere that we are. And so Section 515 sets up, it requires the Secretary of Defense to hold local referenda around each of these foreign military bases and essentially put the question to the native population: do you want the United States military to remain here? And if they say no, then these referenda would have to be held within 1 year. And if they want us to leave, then we have another year to make that happen. So it's a 2-step, 2-year plan. Now, when holding these referenda, we want to demonstrate American democracy in the best way possible. And so secret ballots, it requires that secret ballots be used in such a manner to prevent intimidation, coercion, or reprisals in regards to casting ballots. It ensures that they'll be printed in local language or languages, that they'll be publicized for no less than 60 days before voting concludes, and that the franchise, the voting shall include both men and women of adult age to the fullest extent possible. Again, in some places, this may be an opportunity to demonstrate democracy. And so we want to make it as the best demonstration possible. As far as who'd be able to vote, the eligible voters includes the residential population within 5 miles of the base, any business owners who are within 5 miles of the base, any local residents who work on the base, and then residents of any larger villages, towns, or cities within 5 to 15 miles of the base. The secretary would also be authorized to include any other groups that have ties to the base, as long as anyone who fits into these categories only gets 1 vote. This section directs the secretary to seek the cooperation and approval of the local government in holding the referenda, but they would still be required to carry it out. And by the end of 2023, the secretary shall develop a base closure plan that will respect these preferences, and by October 30th, 2024, complete that base closure plan. Now, there's a lot of things that could be done with some of these military bases. Like, we have a huge, huge refugee problem in the world, right? A lot of these things can be repurposed for more humane purposes. There's a lot of good that could be done with them. But first, we need to settle and start addressing the fundamental question of how many foreign military bases should the United States have around the world? And while this legislation doesn't set a concrete answer, it recognizes that 750 is too many, and that when it comes to closing them down, the low-hanging fruit, the place to start, is places where the local population don't want us there. And so that's what Section 315 does. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Yes. Uh, does there are there additional election security provisions that you didn't mention, such as requiring that counts of the votes happen locally in a decentralized manner?
Um, Thank you, Mixed Chair. I recognize that voting and elections are an important issue to you. No, the safeguards that I mentioned are the only ones that are listed in the bill. Um, if I'd be happy to work with the subcommittee on adding additional protections and safeguard if they think that's necessary.
Fantastic. I do have an email from Tony in California with a question, a little long. Military bases are placed with agreements with foreign states. While allowing the people a referendum is good publicity, you are asking a politician to dismantle US geopolitical and economic power. I would like to see nothing more than my brothers and sisters called home, but the power vacuum and strategic economic access that we have are a stabilizing force. This is one of the most difficult problems the United States has because of the reality of our current geopolitical reality. Won't any politician that supports this will be hammered on the power vacuum problem?
Yeah, I mean those are clearly legitimate questions and concerns. But again, going back to the example of Germany and Japan, we've had our troops there. We've had these foreign military bases for since World War II. Like, how many decades is this going to go on? At some point, we need to confront the reality. And if we set the goal of ending the endless wars, these issues need to be addressed. Yeah, it is true that the United States has determined the geopolitical reality with our global military footprint. I guess as a father, I kind of think of this as, when my kids grow up, it's easy when they're young because I'm the parent, I set the rules for the household, and it just is what it is. And that is the geopolitical reality. But as kids grow up, I have to be willing to share some of that decision-making authority. I have to be willing to let other people have input in how the household is run. And as my kids become adults, give them decision-making authority over their own affairs. That's part of life. And as a parent, that's what I want. I don't want to micromanage my kids' lives from now until eternity. I want them to be able to deal with their affairs on their own. And so, to the extent that the United States is the steward of world security, our goal should be not to be. Our goal should be to encourage the development and growing up of nations around the world where people can handle their own affairs without us needing hundreds and hundreds of foreign military bases and a $750 billion annual budget for the military. Won't any politician who supports this get hammered on the power vacuum problem? Possibly. But that's why this is part of a package deal. End poverty, end mass incarceration, and the endless wars. And not everyone likes everything in this legislative package, just like the framers didn't like everything that was in the Constitution, but they recognized something had to be done. Something had to change to make sure that America was a functional country. And once again, in 2022, it's time for us to make some changes and to ensure that we remain a functional country, a functional democracy. And so, to the extent that a politician may not like these provisions, they're going to have to ask themselves, is this a deal breaker? Would they rather keep tens of millions of Americans living in poverty and millions of Americans waking up behind bars? Would they rather all these other problems continue to exist rather than also fix this problem in a way that is less preferable? Again, this legislative package is driven by Martin Luther King's radical revolution of values of addressing poverty, racism, and militarism. And as I quoted earlier, the costs of militarism, just even to our national psyche, are great indeed, and they need to be rethought and readdressed. And so that's what this section does.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, section 315 is assigned to the Subcommittee on Reducing America's Global Military Footprint. I'd like to thank the delegate for his testimony.
Thank you, Mixed Chair. This was it's got some weighty topics today, but important ones. So thank you for the opportunity.
Of course. The next session of the Phoenix Congress will be held on Thursday, February 24th, when we will review sections 321 to 324 relative to the de-escalation of nuclear proliferation. This hearing is adjourned.